So one of the biggest headaches of this application so far has been the fact that this list order items or this list box does not really give us the amount of control we want in the formatting of our order items when we add them to our order. So, and a number of you have actually made this comment as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of that list order items list box, and instead we're going to use something with a little bit more function or control. So if we go and collapse common controls and choose data, let's go ahead and choose the DataGridView control. Let's drag that and drop it into our form. Now, depending on how we want to handle this, we could dock this to the parent container, which will make it full screen in terms of the size of our application. In this case, I don't want to do that, but we may in the future, depending on the way that you're designing your forms. So I'm going to go ahead and drop it like this. And I'm actually going to show you a setting that you can use in your application as you're designing your forms. There's a setting called anchor. And what the anchor does is it makes sure that the window stays data grid view, I should say, stays sized relative to the size of the rest of the window. So if we anchor it to all four corners, and then we hit start, and I have build errors, probably because I deleted my list box, and I do. So I'm going to go ahead for now, and I'm going to comment these out. So I'm going to highlight them and do Control KC, and that'll comment out those lines. And I'm actually going to put a throw new application exception right here and say, I need to update the order list. And that will cause the app to throw an error in case I forget. So go ahead and hit start. So our dialog will come up, and then if I resize this window to maximized, you see that our grid will resize along with the window. If we didn't do that, then we'd end up with just a window with a little tiny grid inside of it. So we'll go ahead and close that out. All right, so let's go ahead and add functionality to this data grid view. So let's start by giving it a name. So DGV, this will be order. Or actually we'll call it order list because I think our old list box was called order list. And then let's jump back into our form code, and let's jump back to where we had update order. Let's get this out of the way. All right, so before what we were doing was we were saying lst order items dot data source equals null, lst order items dot data source equals our order. So we should be able to delete this, and there is a data source property on the data grid view. So we'll do DGV for data grid view, DGV for data grid view, and we called it DGV order list. So there we go. So let's just do a kind of a stock insertion. So we'll go start, add an item to the order. And I'm pretty sure what happened was when I cut my controls, I dropped my event handlers. So in the previous video, I did a cut of all the controls and then pasted them back. And I think when I did, I lost the wire up for my event handler on my button. So let's stop. Let's go back to the form one. I'm going to click on the button, and then I'm going to click on, I'm just single clicking, not double clicking, single click on the button, and then I'm going to hit this little lightning bolt for events. And you'll see it selects click as the default event. I'm going to now drop down next to it. I'm going to choose my btn add order event handler. Now that's the function that's inside of our form that allows us to add an item to our order. So I dropped down and chose that. So I'm basically rewiring that event handler to that button. So I'll save it. Let's try it again. So we'll hit start. We'll click add item to order. There we go, much better. And now we have our dialog, and we'll just hit add to order. And we'll see here that we now have items showing up in more of a grid fashion. And it says product, quantity, and line item total. So you may be wondering, well, where are these names, these columns coming from? Let's go ahead and stop the app, and let's jump back and take a look. Well, those columns are actually coming from our business models. So if we jump into models here and look at a sales order item, the sales order item has three properties in it. It has a product property, a quantity property, and a line item total property. So what the grid does is it looks at all the properties of the object collection being loaded as the data source, and it takes those properties and treats them as columns. So product, quantity, and line item total. Now, that works great by default. We have product set to have a 2-string overload to present the name, and that's why the name was showing up. If we didn't do that, then we would end up with the class name appearing in that column. Now, what if we want to give it some additional functionality besides what we saw by default? To do that, we can actually come in here and choose Edit Columns, and we can define our own columns. So I'm going to choose Add, and I want to do an unbound one, and I'm going to call it Product Name without a space, and then the column text will say Product Name. And the type of control that it will render into will be a text box. And we'll hit Add. Now the second one we want to add will be Unit Price, and we'll call it Unit Price, and we'll hit Add. Third one will be Quantity, and we'll call it Quantity again, hit Add. And the final one will be Subtotal. Actually, we'll call it, we'll stick with Line Item Total, and we'll click Add again and close. All right, so we've now defined those columns. So I'm just going to hit OK here real fast, and we'll see that those columns come up as they are. All right, so let's jump back into Edit Columns. And the approach that we're going to take involves a few different things. So to set up the data property for our columns, we actually have to use a property of this column called data property name. Now I'll show you what I would think you would do, and I've learned that this is not the right approach. Well, let me show you a simple example. So quantity. So there's a quantity property that we want to use. So that property name is quantity. And subtotal is presented as line item total. So we set those two, and that is basically how it works. Now we have a product property that contains both the product name and the unit price. So you would think that we would go product.name and product.unitPrice. We'll hit OK to that, and we'll run our application again, and we'll add an item. And what happens is the quantity and the subtotal show, but product then gets added as a new column on the end, and our product name and unit price do not show. So after a little bit of Googling on my part and doing some research, the reason for this is that the DataGridView does not understand complex types. It cannot iterate over complex types looking at property children and grandchildren. So in this case, what we need to do is we need to create a class that will take in a sales order item and act as basically like a wrapper that will expose the properties that we want at the surface level.